In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the basics of citing your sources. Our primary objectives are to understand and be able to describe when you should cite sources, to be able to cite sources appropriately, to be able to paraphrase material, and when needed, to use direct quotes. Whenever you use someone else's information, you have to cite it. You have to give credit, saying that this is what someone else has written about this. Most college students know to do that. You've been taught that in some cases since elementary school. When I taught in the K-12 world, I taught for several years middle school. And in the Wichita Public Schools at the time, anyway, there was a big middle school social studies research type project where students were expected to cite sources. And so I know that in that case, for example, seventh graders were taught the importance of citing. And so most people understand that you need to cite when you use a direct quote. When you're using someone else's words, most people know you need to cite that. But you also have to cite even when you put the information in your own words. There are different citation styles, and most disciplines have their own. The three most common in undergraduate education are MLA, APA, and Turabian, which is also called Chicago. It's probably likely that your English composition course or your college composition course, whatever it's called at your college, taught you MLA because that's what English uses. And most colleges therefore teach it in English comp or in college writing classes. It's also used by foreign languages. The second most commonly we used is probably APA. At my community college where I started, we were actually taught APA instead of MLA because most people at that particular college were going into fields where APA was more likely to be used. APA is commonly used in psychology, other social sciences like sociology, often in social work or in human services fields, as well as in education. Turabian is what history uses. It's also called Chicago, and it's used in history and theology and religious studies. All of these formats sometimes are used in sort of modified ways, more or less in other fields also. But many other fields have their own. There is a science style, and sometimes that is actually divided up into a chemistry style and other sciences. There is a style for journalism, which is AP style. But these are the three big ones. Your instructor might have a preference. Be sure to ask them after you read the instructions to make sure the preference isn't given there. So for the classes that I teach, often because of requirements by the college, there's a certain style that has to be used. And so there's going to be a follow-up video if you want to watch it that will discuss some specifics of the style that's either preferred or required for the class, depending on the class. Most people know that you don't have to cite if something is common knowledge. But the issue is it really common knowledge or not? You have to decide that for yourself. And so one thing you should think about is to ask yourself this series of questions. Did you know that information before you read it? In other words, before reading it in the website you found or the article you found or the book you read, could you have already explained it to somebody else? As you were doing research, did you find the same information in 3 or more sources that didn't cite each other or didn't cite a common source? And or is it something that an educated adult in the US could reasonably be expected to know or is a basic fact? Whether or not you know it, you can sort of judge for yourself, is it something that's reasonable? So you might not remember that the capital of Louisiana is Baton Rouge, but it's relatively common information. It's someone that an educated adult could reasonably be expected to know. A basic fact. You might not know that the capital of Ethiopia is Addis Ababa, but that is just sort of a common fact and it's not something you would need to cite. You would need to cite, however, sort of more information about it. Like if you said, oh, well, the population of Baton Rouge is blah, 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 you should cite where you got that figure. The population of Ethiopia is blah, blah, blah. You should cite where you got that figure. But general information, there are 50 states in the United States. You don't need to cite that. I don't know how many states there are in Mexico off the top of my head, but you probably wouldn't need to cite that either. But on the other hand, you might need to cite details about Mexico's governmental system. It's important that if you're ever uncertain whether or not you should cite something, err on the side of caution. If you're ever uncertain, you should cite it. The cites that we normally use are parenthetical citations. These are also called in-text or internal citations. Sometimes Turabian uses footnotes. No other style currently uses footnotes. They used to be very popular back in the day. They're not popular now. In fact, Turabian doesn't always use footnotes either. We usually use parentheses at the end of a sentence as part of the sentence for our citation. Sometimes instead of using citations, we call them references instead. Doesn't matter what you call them, please use them. When you find information from a source, even when you put it in your own words, you have to include that in your paper, and you use it immediately after the information. Now, if all information in the paragraph comes from the same source and none of it is your own opinion, none of it is your own interpretation, none of it is your own argument, then the citation could appear at the end of the last sentence of the paragraph. Make sure your reader knows what's come from a different source. Normally, in a research type paper, there should be at least one citation per paragraph. Even if you have 3 paragraphs in a row and they're all from the same source, there should be a citation in each paragraph. Not in each sentence, but in each paragraph. So it's okay to have the same citation in more than one paragraph. Paraphrasing is tricky. Paraphrasing is putting the information entirely in your own words. It is not the same as just finding synonyms for the words in the original. So if you had a sentence, the king ruled harshly, and you got your thesaurus out, or you right-clicked in Word to find synonyms, and you rewrote that sentence as the monarch reigned strictly, that is not a paraphrase. That is the same sentence structure as the original. That is too close for you to use. And honestly, you can't paraphrase at a sentence level successfully. What you want to do is paraphrase ideas from throughout the material. This is why you've probably had teachers in the past tell you to take notes as you read. That's a good idea. Do not have the original open in front of you as you're trying to paraphrase it. You will end up plagiarizing it instead, which we don't want. It's a bad thing. So a paraphrase is tied to material that might be on one page or maybe 2 successive pages. A summary is more general. A summary might cover an entire article or section or chapter or even book. A summary also needs a parenthetical citation. And then direct quotes. You've used direct quotes before. You've probably had teachers at some point tell you have to use maybe even so many direct quotes. For most college writing, unless your instructor tells you something else, you seldom need to use direct quotes. If you do, make sure the direct quote is exactly 100% correct. Triple check for typos. Remember, Word or other spell checkers don't catch every typo. You might mean to type in and you type if. Since if is still a word that's spelled right, it might not get caught. Check for typos. A rule of thumb that's usually used is that no more than 10% of a paper should be direct quotes. So if you were assigned a 500-word essay, which would be about 2 pages roughly, no more than 50 words total should be direct quotes. Direct quotes, of course, are always put inside quotation marks. They are always cited. If you leave material out from a direct quote, particularly from the middle, use an ellipses, 3 periods with 1 space between each one. If you need to add material, you put it in brackets to show that it's something that you have added to the quote. You only add something if you really, really, really need to explain something to add context to the quote. Do that very sparingly. Don't do it a lot. You might not do it at all in an entire paper, and that's good. The word sic, which means thus in Latin, is used if material in a direct quote is inaccurate or might be perceived as offensive. It's usually best to restate the material rather than use sic. Don't overuse sic. There's going to be some things, especially say in a history class, you're looking at primary sources from the 1700s. And rules for spelling and punctuation and grammar were different then. Those rules change over time. You don't want to put sic after every misspelled word. Similarly, if you are writing in the US and you're quoting something from British English, there are words that are spelled differently, like the word color has a U in it in British English and it doesn't have a U in it in American English. You usually don't need to use the word sic if you have a direct quote and the spelling issue, that's not really an error, that's just a different way of writing English happens. So avoid overusing it. Don't use sic to try to embarrass the original author. As in, look at how foolish this person is. I'm so much smarter. That's why I'm putting sic 20 times in this quote. Don't do that. If the author sometimes will use language that may not have been considered offensive in his or her own time, but is considered offensive now or potentially offensive, it's usually best to just restate the material, to paraphrase it, unless there's a good reason for including it. So as I mentioned, whenever you make a change in a direct quote, that change we need to put in square brackets, not parentheses, brackets like you see on the screen. So if you change the tense, you go from past tense to present tense or present tense to past tense, if it doesn't affect the meaning of the quote, you would use brackets like that. So like for example here, maybe the original was the strategy results in great profits, and you are changing it to past tense. The strategy resulted in great profits. Something like that, you would put a bracket in to show that's a change that you have made. Don't do this ever if it affects the meaning of the quote. If you are not sure what the meaning of the quote is, you should not use the quote in your writing. If you have a lengthy quote, special rules apply, and those rules vary by citation style. That's called a block quote. And sometimes a block quote is defined as the number of words it is, like 40. Sometimes it's the number of lines it is, like 4 or 5. It varies, so you need to look it up for the citation style. And one thing you can do is just Google block quote and APA or block quote MLA or block quote Turabian, and you will find the rules for a block quote. In addition to internal citations, you also need a reference page at the end of your essay. It's always a separate page. In MLA format, it's called a works cited page. In some forms of Turabian, sometimes it's called a bibliography. It's the same idea though. APA calls it a references page, which is what I'm going to call it. It has very specific requirements, and those requirements as applied to the format that you're supposed to use in my class will be in the follow-up video. But here are some general guidelines. Every citation in your paper has to be tied to an entry in your references list. So if you cite something in your paper, it needs to be in the references list. There are some very specific exceptions for some fields. In Turabian, for example, you don't need to cite references to the Christian Bible unless your book is about a particular translation or your essay is about a particular translation. In general, make sure every citation ties to an entry in your references list. And vice versa. If something is in the reference list, it needs to tie to an internal citation. References are typically alphabetized by the last name of the first listed author. Whatever author is listed first on the article or the website or the book, that person's last name is what you use to alphabetize. If there is no person, if there's an organization as an author, like the Department of Defense, then that is what you list as the author. If there's no organization and no person, you then use the title of the article or the title of the book. References provide publication information so others could easily find the source material. Common references that we will use. One is book references. These usually require the information you see on the slide. It does vary a little bit from citation style to citation style. But typically the authors of the book, the title, if there's a subtitle, that as well, the copyright year, if it's not the first edition, then what edition it is, who is the publisher, and other than for APA, place of publication. There are three main types of articles: journal articles, which most academic writing prefers, magazine articles, and newspaper articles. Typically, article references for journals need the author's names, the journal title, the article title, the journal volume, and it will say that somewhere like volume 12 or VOL 12, or it might just give that number after the title. The journal number, which is the issue that year. So a journal might have 4 issues a year, or 6 issues a year, or 12 issues a year. You need the year that the journal was published in, or sometimes the month and year. You need the page range, and you need a DOI, which is the digital object identifier. It is a code that is assigned to every article, and sometimes now to electronic books as well. Not every article will have one, and if one isn't there, that's okay. Magazines are very similar. For a magazine, you don't include volume or number. Instead of year, you include month and year. And newspapers are similar to magazines in terms of you talk about the month and the year. Requirements for web pages vary. Check the follow-up video. Usually you'll need the author. If there is no author, then the sponsoring organization, if it's known. The date. You sometimes have to dig for the date. You could use, for example, a copyright date. You can also, if you aren't sure but you have a guess, you can put the date often with a question mark after it, like 2019 question mark if you're fairly sure it was from 2019 but aren't positive. If for internal quotes from web pages, if you need to use a page number, you're going to use a paragraph number instead that you will just count. Do not print a web page off and use those page numbers in your printer because the page numbers there vary from printer to printer. Finally, some notes. Please make sure you double check the spelling of things like titles and authors' names. Make sure to include every author given, unless there's a whole bunch, in which case those requirements vary by format. But if there are 2 or 3 or even 4 authors, you normally include all of them in your references page. And then finally, online help. One excellent source is the Online Writing Lab at Purdue University. It is widely used. You can just go to Google or the search engine of your choice and search for Purdue OWL and the format you're interested in, like Purdue OWL APA or Purdue OWL Turabian. Purdue also gives general information on citing, including more information than this very brief overview gave over things like summarizing and paraphrasing and stuff like that. It's very useful, and I strongly recommend using that resource. Your college may also have an online writing lab. I recommend using that as a resource also. That information should be available in your course shell. You might be able to get it from your instructor, or you might be able to find it on the web page of your college. Your college's online writing lab will help answer any specific questions you have, and often they will be willing to read over your essay and give you feedback on it. Often they want specific things that you want help with. So if you struggle with writing introductions, you could say, here's my essay, could you read this over and give me help with my introduction? Or if you struggle with citations, can you give me help with citations? Finally, contact your college's librarian. College librarians work typically year-round. Whether it's a summer class or not, you can usually reach them by email, and they may have help on citations. They may be able to draw your attention to your college's library's website, which might have citation tools, as well as they are a great source for using the databases that your college subscribes to. And I promise you that no matter what college in the US you attend as you are watching this video, that college library almost certainly subscribes to numerous databases that you can and should use to get sources for your writing. Having said that, one final tip: when you use a database, do not use a date. Do not. You have to. Just because something's included in a database doesn't mean it's appropriate for your paper. Many of the databases that colleges subscribe to are also subscribed to by high schools and middle schools. And so some of the sources in the databases are designed for high school and middle school students. Those sources are unacceptable for college writing, even if you right now are still in high school. You may not use Junior Scholastic for a college essay. You may not use Scope for a college essay. You may not use the New York Times for Kids for a college essay. Those are sources that may be appropriate in a high school setting, or certainly in a middle school setting, but they are not appropriate for college writing unless you're going into education and are writing about those sources sort of as sources. So if you have any questions about this presentation, please send me an email. I hope it helps. Good luck as you write and research.